Hello everyone, welcome to Chess Highlights channel. Today we would analyze the game between Ding Liren vs Gukesh DOMMARAJU in World Championship 2024 Game 14. Ding Liren starts with the ready opening, controlling the central e4 square indirectly with his knight. Gukesh responds by occupying the center with a pawn. Ding Liren push g3, prepare to fianchettos his bishop on the kingside, aiming for control of the long diagonal. Gukesh plays the Sicilian defense structure, challenging Ding Liren's control of the d4 square. Ding Liren completes his kingside fianchetto. Gukesh develops his knight, preparing to challenge the center further. Ding Liren stakes a claim in the center, opening lines for his pieces. Gukesh responds with a solid pawn structure, often leading to closed or semi-closed positions. Ding Liren castles kingside for safety and brings his rook into the game. Gukesh captures Ding Liren's central pawn, opening the c-file. Ding Liren recaptures the pawn with his knight, bringing it to a central and active square. Gukesh develops his second knight, preparing to challenge Ding Liren's knight on d4. Ding Liren plays a pawn break in the center, aiming to open the position further. Gukesh captures Ding Liren's knight on d4. Ding Liren recaptures the knight with his queen, maintaining central control. Gukesh develops his remaining knight, putting pressure on Ding Liren's queen and the d4 square. Ding Liren retreats his queen to d1, likely anticipating pressure along the d-file. Gukesh pushes his d-pawn forward, restricting Ding Liren's pieces and gaining space. Ding Liren develops his pawn, attacking the d4 pawn. Gukesh develops his bishop to an active square, putting pressure on Ding Liren's f2 pawn and controlling important diagonals. Ding Liren exchanges pawns, opening the e-file. Gukesh recaptures with his bishop, maintaining a strong presence on the long diagonal. Ding Liren develops his knight, preparing to challenge Gukesh's bishop on d4. Gukesh castles kingside for safety and brings his rook into the game. Ding Liren's knight jumps to b5, putting pressure on bishop and c7 square. Gukesh retreats his bishop to b6 to maintaining its influence on the a7-g1 diagonal. Ding Liren plays b3, intending to develop his bishop to b2 and control the long diagonal. Gukesh plays a6, attack the knight, preventing Ding Liren's knight from jumping to c4 and preparing to expand on the queenside. Ding Liren retreats his knight to c3, likely aiming to redeploy it to a more active square later. Gukesh's bishop returns to d4, maintaining its strong central position and pressure on Ding Liren's f2 pawn. Ding Liren develops his bishop to b2, controlling the long diagonal as planned. Gukesh pushes his e-pawn, challenging Ding Liren's central control and opening lines for his pieces. Ding Liren moves his queen to d2, potentially preparing to support a pawn push or move to the kingside or to put his rook on d1. Gukesh develops his light square bishop to e6, maintaining control of important squares and potentially preparing to attack on the kingside. Ding Liren's knight jumps to d5, a strong central outpost, putting pressure on Gukesh's pieces. Gukesh pushes his b-pawn, aiming to challenge Ding Liren's knight on d5 and create space on the queenside. Ding Liren captures the b-pawn with his c-pawn, opening the c-file and attacking the knight. Gukesh recaptures with his pawn. Ding Liren retreats his knight to f4, attacking Gukesh's knight and bishop at the same time. Gukesh captures Ding Liren's knight with his e-pawn, opening the e-file. Ding Liren captures Gukesh's knight on c6 with his bishop, potentially weakening Gukesh's pawn structure. Gukesh recaptures Ding Liren's bishop with his bishop. Ding Liren recaptures Gukesh's bishop with his queen, consolidating his material advantage. Gukesh brings his rook to the open b-file to protect b-pawn. Ding Liren brings his other rook to the d-file to attack the queen and controlling the open file. Gukesh moves his queen to b6, attacking Ding Liren's bishop. Ding Liren retreat his bishop to f3, still maintained to control important diagonals and potentially preparing to attack on the kingside. Gukesh captures Ding Liren's g-pawn with his f-pawn. Ding Liren recaptures the pawn with his h-pawn, opening the h-file. Gukesh pushes his passed b-pawn further. Ding Liren pushes his a-pawn, trying to create a passed pawn on the a-file. Gukesh captures Ding Liren's a-pawn with his b-pawn. This move is called en passant. Now Gukesh creating a passed pawn on the a-file. Ding Liren take the pawn without any doubt. And now Ding Liren has a passed pawn on b-file. This is a poisoned pawn. Black should never take this free pawn. Gukesh plays g6. Ding Liren moves his queen to d4, aiming to exchange the queen and controlling central squares. Gukesh moves his queen to b5. Ding Liren pushes his b-pawn. Gukesh captures Ding Liren's b-pawn with his queen. And now Gukesh win one pawn. Ding Liren recaptures Gukesh's queen with his queen. Gukesh recaptures Ding Liren's queen with his rook, leading to a rook endgame. After that, Ding Liren challenged to exchange the rook. This is a simplification technique. It looks like Ding Liren are ready to draw. Gukesh captures Ding Liren's. Ding Liren captures Gukesh's rook with his bishop, leaving a bishop versus rook endgame. The game continued with Gukesh pushes his g-pawn. Ding Liren moves his bishop to d5, another challenge to exchange the piece. But Gukesh refuses and moves his bishop to f5, controlling important diagonals and preventing Ding Liren's bishop from advancing. Ding Liren brings his rook to the c-file, aiming to put pressure on Gukesh's position. Gukesh moves his king to g7, getting closer to his g-pawn. Ding Liren moves his rook to c7, attacking Gukesh's g-pawn and restricting Gukesh's king. Gukesh retreats his bishop to g6, defending the g-pawn. Ding Liren moves his rook to c4. Once again Ding Liren try to exchange the piece. And once again, Gukesh refuse. Gukesh plays a check with his rook on b1, forcing Ding Liren's king to move. Seems like Gukesh really want to win this game. Ding Liren moves his king to g2 out of the check. Gukesh moves his rook to e1, continuing to put pressure on Ding Liren's position and controlling the first rank. Ding Liren moves his rook to b4. Gukesh pushes his h-pawn, potentially trying to create another passed pawn. Ding Liren moves his rook to a4. Gukesh moves his rook to e5, attacking Ding Liren's bishop. Ding Liren moves his bishop to f3, controlling important diagonals. Gukesh moves his king to h6, getting closer to his h-pawn. Ding Liren moves his king to g1. Gukesh moves his rook to e6, maintaining control of the e-file. Ding Liren moves his rook to c4. Gukesh pushes his passed g-pawn further, creating a dangerous threat. Ding Liren moves his bishop to d5 to attack the rook. Gukesh moves his rook to d6 to counter-attack the bishop. Ding Liren moves his bishop to b7. Gukesh moves his king to g5 to occupying the center. Ding Liren plays f3 trying to create counterplay. Gukesh pushes his f-pawn, trying to create another potential passed pawn. Ding Liren captures Gukesh's g-pawn with his f-pawn. Gukesh recaptures with his h-pawn. Ding Liren moves his rook to b4. Gukesh moves his bishop to f7 to activate his piece. Ding Liren moves his king to f2. Gukesh plays a check with his rook on d2, forcing Ding Liren's king to move again. Ding Liren moves his king to g1. Gukesh moves his king to f6. Ding Liren checks Gukesh's king with his rook. Gukesh moves his king to g5 again to hide from another check. Ding Liren retreats his rook to b4 out of the attack. Gukesh moves his bishop to e6, controlling important diagonals and potentially preparing to support his passed pawns. Ding Liren moves his rook to a4. Gukesh moves his rook to b2, attacking Ding Liren's bishop. Ding Liren save his bishop to a8. Gukesh moves his king to f6, another preparing to create passed pawns. Ding Liren moves his rook to f4, attacking Gukesh's f-pawn. Gukesh moves his king to e5. Actually, this is a draw position. But Ding Liren make a big blunder. Ding Liren retreats his rook to f2. By this move, Ding Liren once again want to simplify the game. The world is going crazy. Everybody saw on the game and realized that Gukesh would be the youngest world champion ever if he find the correct move. Without hesitation, Gukesh captures Ding Liren's rook with his rook, leaving a bishop versus king endgame with passed pawns. Ding Liren recaptures the rook with his king. Gukesh moves his bishop to d5, controlling important squares, restricting Ding Liren's king, and the most important is to force to exchange the bishop. Ding Liren has to capture Gukesh's bishop. Gukesh recaptures Ding Liren's bishop with his king, leaving a king and pawn endgame. Ding Liren still tried to move his king to e3, but Gukesh moves his king to e5. After this move, Ding Liren resign. Gukesh DOMMARAJU officially become the world champion and the youngest ever. There are no possibility for white to draw this game except another big blunder. But this is world championship level of chess.